Let me first start by thanking the organizers for this really kind invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here to see all of the process systems community here, basically recognizing George for his many contributions to our field. And congratulations, George, on your birthday and on all your plans going forward after this. So congratulations. And I wanted to start by coming up with a rather presumptuous title. I noticed that looking into the future is a big part of this workshop. And I wanted to go and talk a bit about what I would call process optimization. So to do this, what I'd like to do is start with a fairly basic concept, which is, what do people think of as optimization? And they think of it as a glorified case studies. You build a model, and what you do is then you run a bunch of cases with certain inputs over here, and maybe some trajectories over here. You solve that model many times, and there's usually some kind of procedure, some guide that helps you come up with that. And then it decides for some reason that it's done, okay, and you decide that that's the best you're gonna do. All right, so that mindset has been around for a long time. It's been around in commercial products as well. And it's one of those things where you wonder, well, can I do better? And a lot of people look at this and say, sure, I can do better. I can just use my brain and get some insight into the process and do it that way. But to be honest, it is something that engineers do, whether they realize it consciously or not, okay? And what you're talking about here is equipment and flow sheet design. You're talking about process operations, looking at transients and upsets. You're looking at planning, scheduling, parameter estimation, model discrimination. And this is one of the reasons why it's good to adopt some kind of systematic approach, right? I mean, it's better than just doing the experiential thing, the intuitive thing, and it's consistent among practitioners. But there's something more we can do, and that is to say that we can embed that optimization problem inside the solution of the model. We can do these simultaneously. We can find ways to actually accelerate the process and actually get more information out of the model, which allows us then to say with more certainty what we end up with, okay? So that's basically what has motivated me and several others in terms of thinking about process optimization. Now, it's interesting because if you go back and you look at some early work, then that early work had the same idea. Okay? There's the idea of not saying, let's not do glorified case studies, but let's actually go ahead and think about the optimization problem and develop a different way of solving it. Okay? So this is the paper that Manfred talked about earlier this morning. It's actually kind of a nice way of resolving this method of multipliers, looking at a way of coming up with convexifying the Lagrange function, forming things like augmented Lagrangians, and then also being able to decompose them by going further and modifying that. So a wonderful paper that was written at that time, work that George did and Art Westerberg did, and the amazing thing with Art is if he's sitting right here, still looks the same. So, but the interesting thing with this paper is also that there was a small companion paper here that basically applied this to a chemical process, okay? And so this was actually kind of nice. You see this, and then you look at this paper here that actually picks it up with an example, shows how it works in some detail, and basically makes it accessible to people who want to do process optimization in the community. Okay, so this is actually something that motivates us all to start thinking about getting away from glorified case studies and focusing on the optimization problem. Now, what's happened since then? Well, quite a few things have happened. In the 80s, there was a realization from a number of people that SQP is actually kind of a nice thing. I remember reading Art's first papers on this, going back from work that Mike Powell had done, and then saying, okay, let's use that to solve problems, and you get about 100 variables and constraints. You can expand that to a decomposition approach, and there are several of these, that I like to call reduced SQP. So this is what you'll find in Aspen Plus, okay, in the modular simulator. This is what you'll find in real-time optimization codes, okay, and those have been around now for over 20 years. And then there's also the way of saying, okay, this is great as long as you don't have too many degrees of freedom, let's say 100 tops. If you have more, it gets a little slow. If you want to do dynamic optimization with many degrees of freedom, then you start thinking about barrier approaches, okay? And there you can handle problems with 1 million variables and constraints, reasonably good time. And then there's some other thing that pops out of this. If you want to solve a perturbed problem from a solution that you already have, and it doesn't matter how big that problem is, you can get a very good approximate perturbed solution instantaneously. And that's what's in SIP-opt, okay? So these are the kinds of tools that have happened since that early work. And what you can say now is the most efficient NLP tools now handle millions of variables and constraints with modest computational effort, okay? But now as chemical engineers, we actually have to think about something more. It's not enough that those tools are available. A really good power saw will help you build a house, or it will cut off your arm, okay? You decide what you want to do with it, okay? So the point is, if you want to build a house, you need the right environment to do that, okay? So what you're looking at is you're looking at things like the black box approaches, the simulation-based models with an optimizer tied around that. That's what you get down here. And the number of degrees of freedom that you can handle here is in this range, okay? You can also go all the way to the front, where you start as an optimization model. You basically expose everything that you can to the optimizer. And these are things that you've seen in equation-based formulations. There are many modeling platforms, and the one I can think of back early on is the work that was done at Imperial and at Carnegie Mellon with SpeedUp and with Ascend. And what you have then is the opportunity to gradually open up these models and to mate them with the appropriate algorithm, okay? So starting down here, you have derivative-free optimization. Going all the way up here, you have the barrier approaches, can handle the millions of variables, and the number of simulation time equivalents it takes to do a moderate-sized optimization goes anywhere from several hundred, sometimes even several thousand, all the way up to 1, where the model and the optimization problem are essentially doing the same amount of work, and then it solves. So this is the kind of thing that's happened over the last few years. These are the advantages that we've said. And now where do we go into the future? And to go into the future, I'll use this word, equation-oriented utopia, okay? And the equation-oriented utopia is coming. It is almost here, okay? And depending on who you talk to, I think you'll say it has been here for a while, okay? So what we're talking about here is glass box models, where you have exact Jacobians, exact Hessians, sparse equation structure. Talking about fast Newton-based solvers, you're talking about the ability to do post-optimality analysis and interpretation, and then you can use that as a springboard to go to mixed integer programming, to deterministic global optimization, and then doing stochastic optimization to deal with uncertainty, and also to deal with non-smoothness, okay? Things like MPECs and MPCCs that allow you to deal with complementarity constraints. So those are the kinds of things that are coming, and they're available. And I wanted to share with you what kinds of problems you're able to solve when you do this. So here's a problem that we worked on 10 years ago, okay? This was a really neat problem. It was kind of an important societal problem that we worked on with Sandia National Labs. And this is basically a fault detection system. What it says is if there's a contaminant in a municipal water network, find out where it occurred, how much it occurred, and, well, basically how much got into it and when it occurred, okay? And then what you have is a sensor network, and the challenge is also to build that sensor network, but you have that sensor network that basically says, okay, given that, can I solve that identification problem? So it's kind of a neat problem. So there's the fault, there's the sensor network, and you have all these measurements here that you can take, and now take that model and solve the inverse problem, okay? So, good. You make a couple assumptions. You have pumps, valves, and pipes. You have storage tanks and junctions. And then you think about what you can make as assumptions for the model in terms of mixing at nodes, plug flow in the pipes, etc. Reasonable things. And here's an interesting one. Hydraulics and water quality are decoupled. In other words, if you have a contaminant in there, your pipe flow is independent of that. Okay, you calculate that first and then figure out how the contaminant moves along. Okay, so here's the problem, okay? So think about this. What we've got here is, if you go through it, objective function, model of the pipeline, mixing at the junctions, mixing tanks, and so forth. So there you've got your node injection points over here. Here's where you can inject the contaminant at each node K. And then what you have over here is pipe boundary conditions, okay? And then what you have, injection terms have to be non-negative. And there you have something with spatial dependence. Okay, so this was kind of an interesting problem that we looked at. Bear in mind, we know the flows, or at least we can get an idea of the flows before we solve this problem. All right, now let's take a closer look at this. How would you like to approach this problem? Do you discretize in space and time, or do you move with the particles? Okay, so on the left-hand side, you can discretize in space and time. Back when we looked at this problem, we said, you know, this can, for a city where you have maybe 500 or 1,000 or several thousands nodes, discretizing every pipe segment might get a little bit large. But what you can do, because you know the water flows, is you can do this Lagrangian model, okay? Basically track each packet of fluid, okay? So if you track each packet of fluid, what you can do is you can say, okay, what you know is the contaminant at this time, at node A, is going to be the same as the contaminant at a later time, okay? And so what you do is basically build these variable time delay models, put them together, and then every node and every concentration at every discretized point in time is going to be related back to something at another point in time. And you build this variable time delay model, and it gets really large, okay? So there's your simulator that basically gives you the flows, tells you how to get the time delays. You build in this discretized model where you have the elements of the inlet and the outlet flows, and there's the time delay model. You relate that back to everything that goes through a node plus the contaminant, and then you have your objective function. So this is the discretized problem, and it's a nice problem, but it's huge, okay? So let's see what happens when you solve it. So there's the problem. And these are some simulations that Carl Laird put together. So what you have is over 1,000 numerical tests on a municipal water network. It's about 500 nodes. You know, it's not every tap, but it's a pretty good sized problem. You can link that to the water flow network simulator. It's got about 250,000 variables, 45,000 degrees of freedom, solves in 2 minutes, okay? Solves in 2 minutes. That's what the optimizers are able to do these days, okay? And this is the result, okay? Those thousands of tests are basically what happens if you increase the placement of sensors and where do you put them. And then during the injection, you figure out, okay, what can you estimate, okay? And then what you can't estimate, okay? And we do this brute force. We just solve the problem and see what happens. And you can see from this color code, there's a little bit of smearing. But in fact, you can add integer variables, there aren't that many, and you can actually get unique solutions by solving something called an MIQP, all right? And that actually will allow you to get unique solutions that will pinpoint where the contaminants are. So in this case, there were 4 cases where we could have a contaminant, lots of nodes that could be added, and that's the idea. And so what is allowed is that with that CPU time, this is effective in a real-time setting. Okay, now, let's ask a question. Suppose I have some uncertainty in my flow simulator. Suppose it's actually uncertain for various reasons. There are disturbances in the inputs. And so as a result of that, what you'd like to do is you'd like to sample those and then come up with a way that will do a robust fit or robust determination in order for you to come up with the best solution. Okay, how can you do that? Well, what you end up doing is something fairly straightforward, which is called a multi-scenario problem. Okay, so what you have here is you have basically trying to find out decision variables that are true for all the scenarios or common to all the scenarios. And then you have these flows here that are basically derived from doing simulations at sampling points, okay? So you put that problem together and it has a structure that looks like this, okay? Each of these is an optimization problem that we solved before. This is the 250,000 optimization problem that I showed you in previous slides. You put one together for each sampling point, okay, and then you have these coupling variables that basically take care of the common variables over here. Okay, put it together. And now what you can also do is modify the code. The algorithm doesn't change, but the way you input the model, they're all the same except for those red constraints. They all look the same. They're composite NLPs. And the solver here, of course, has this beautiful structure over here, which is block-bordered diagonal, okay? And this is the size of the problem, okay? So now what you can do is you can realize that with a structure like that, and with the way these things are described, you can solve it in parallel, okay? You use a Schur complement algorithm, you solve it in parallel on the block-bordered structure, and if you look at that, what you end up with is you end up with, let's say, a problem size like this with 32 scenarios. You end up with 1.2 million variables. This is the solution time. There's a little glitch here in communication with the different processors. So that's basically what happened 10 years ago. And what you see as a result of this is 1.2 variables solves in 20 minutes. Okay? So that is possible. And in fact, that is pretty straightforward, and it's done all the time. Okay? So this was great. We were happy to see this. We were happy to see what could be done with Schur complements. And I can tell you that, for example, what Carl has done with this technology is moved it by another order of magnitude, where he's been able to solve much, much larger problems than what I just showed you here. Now let's think about something else. This one here takes advantage of the structure that we had here. Okay, this optimization problem. Suppose I have a structure that is like this. This is a dynamic optimization problem. Okay, so it does not quite decompose nicely into those common variables. What I'm doing here is I'm trying to calculate control profiles, okay? And so in that case, I could either say, let me smush all these problems together, all these variables together, and have it look like this, and send it to a generic algorithm, which is the best generic algorithm I can think of right now, okay? And that does a nice sparse factorization to calculate the Newton step of the optimality conditions. Or I can take advantage of this structure. And this matrix, after I rearrange it, looks like this, okay? So it's almost block diagonal, except for these identity matrices over here, and that gives me a block tridiagonal system. So how do I solve this thing? Well, this is kind of fun. So how do I do that in parallel? Well, this is interesting. So there's my block tridiagonal system. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something where I take the even and the odd components and I separate them. I put all the all the odd blocks over here, put all the even blocks over here, and when you do that, then these off diagonals here, they basically go in these corners here. So, pivot on these blocks over here to get rid of this thing, and guess what happens? Well, this thing here, after I pivot on it, gives me this Schur complement matrix over here, but it's block diagonal. It's still tridiagonal, okay? So what I can do is I can take this tridiagonal matrix over here and basically do the same thing on these things. Divide it up into two and then do it again, okay? And so I take that guy and move it up and apply the same algorithm to this little piece. And then I do it again, cut it in half, do it again, cut it in half, and keep doing that. And all the time I do that in parallel, okay? And so in the end what happens is you have an algorithm that doesn't get bogged down with a big Schur complement that cannot be parallelized, and then just it basically addresses it one at a time until you're done. So this is basically the idea of cyclic reduction. We applied this to dynamic optimization. It's a really nice trick because the off-diagonal elements over here are tiny. They are really small. But what we're interested in is seeing when we have big blocks that correspond to huge dynamic models. So that's cyclic reduction down here as we increase the block size and the density of the sparse blocks. This is the thing that happens this is the best MATLAB solver you have. Anyone that uses MATLAB, you know about backslash. Backslash is a poly algorithm. Depending on how big your problem is, it chooses the right way to decompose a matrix. So in this case, backslash was not very different than the LBL sparse matrix solver over here, but you can see that in terms of the times, and this was with 12 processors, you were doing pretty well. Okay, so these are some preliminary results, but it shows you that you can actually do quite better as the dynamic model gets bigger and bigger, okay? This is important because Amdahl's law supersedes Moore's law, right? Moore's law, we know that we're not going to get that huge increase in performance, huge reduction in clock speed anymore, okay, per chip. What they're doing instead is they're putting in more processors into the laptops. So what we have to do is make sure that the optimization algorithms are going to include and take advantage of those multiprocessors. This is the way we will do it, okay? These algorithms, especially the traditional LBL factorizations, have a hard time keeping up with Amdahl's law, and that's where we have to go. So we have to embrace these parallel decompositions. So, prediction 2040, okay? I think Costas warned me not to make predictions, but I'm going to try it anyway. Enabling tools. Structured NLPs with billions of variables, friendly, powerful, and intelligent optimization modeling environments. And there's some progress I didn't talk about there. Distributed optimization solvers, parallel ones, and integrated with advanced parallel architecture environments. This will go for dynamic global network models, including smart grids, gas and oil pipeline optimization, enterprise-wide dynamic real-time optimization. It's only 23 years away, but I think we're seeing a lot of progress in that direction. Okay, now I want to go to another paper that George wrote in 1980. And this one was actually one that I enjoyed reading a few weeks ago. Rather provocative one. In fact, something that caused some interesting discussion, something that I think is still, if you read that paper, you see a lot of the insight that was in there, and it's still valuable today. And it's this idea here. Synthesis of process flow sheets, heuristic design, or a utopia of mathematical programming. Bear in mind, we're 1980, so we're 37 years after that. So we can basically now think more of utopias. But the idea here was to look at it from both sides. And it's a beautiful review of the state-of-the-art of process synthesis. George talked about basically progress on the optimization front, progress on the heuristic front. Basically, the breakthrough there was the pinch technology that was featured in here. But it wasn't the only thing. It was basically dealing with heat exchangers, with distillation sequences, with reaction paths, with reactor networks. Basically a very thorough and very nice review. And then the question, where do we go from here? And so this was kind of the framework that he put together and said, okay, this is basically the synthesis problem, okay? And so what we want to do is we want to get a lot of insight. We want to put a lot of calculations to support that insight and basically drive a solution. And then, of course, there is still the importance of doing some optimization. And the one metaphor that he used that was very important was to think of this as a chess game, where you have a start game where the moves are pretty well known, the standard features are well known. You have an end game where the combinatorics are all gone, and there are pretty straightforward ways of finishing the game and winning. And then there's the mid-game, where you're faced with a very difficult structure, and if you don't do it right and take advantage of the combinatorics, that usually decides the game, okay? And that's where I think I realized the importance of these boxes here. So, but what's more important is the importance of process insight, the importance of figuring out what the model should do and how the optimization should be guided by process insight. And for that, I wanted to show you an interesting story. What we have here is bunches of models, okay? And they're not always equation-oriented models, okay? They are actually quite different beasts. They're heterogeneous. And so here we have a flow sheet, and you basically come up with the model that you have for these things. And then what you want to do is talk about different conservation laws. Usually the linear ones are nice to have. The physical properties, they can get a bit tough. The separation models, you have lots of levels of modeling, and then the reaction elements, you can take it all the way from stoichiometric models to CFD and multi-phase. This is very similar to what Costas talked about this morning, and the importance of dealing with these multiple models kind of as a multi-phase and a multi-scale problem. But now let's take a look at this and ask the question, if we have these really good optimization strategies, can we apply them to complex simulation models? And the thing we want to do is say, well, yes, people build surrogate models all the time that are also glass box models. Question is, are they any good? Okay? And so this is really the issue. There are different kinds of surrogate-based models. We saw this morning about the idea of data-driven models that replace the physics, okay? And basically are ways of, if you have enough data, you basically build these models and use them to make decisions. There are spectral model reductions, there are physics-based model reductions, and the question is, are they usable in an optimization context? Okay. Well, this is actually kind of a good question, and there is an answer to this. The answer is they are usable as long as they are consistent and stable. Familiar concepts from controls theory and from approximation theory. You want the reduced model to recognize the optimal point, let's say a KKT point with second order conditions. You want also to make sure that when you do an optimization with a reduced model, you're making improvement during that sequence of steps toward the optimum of the original model, which I call the ODM, okay? So if you have these two properties, you can prove that you're going to converge to the solution of the original model, okay? That's nice. So let's take a look, okay? So the way you can do that is basically by building a reduced model at a point and then taking a step. And if that step shows that your model error is too big, well, then you have to cut back on that step. Put it in a trust region. Then take the step and guide that trust region very carefully until you converge. Now, why is that important? Let's take a look. This is an example that's very old, and I've talked about it before, but it was one thing that got me very excited when I interviewed at CMU, okay? Because this had to do with the inside-out algorithm in Aspen. And Art kind of teased me a little bit and said, I have a counterexample. Okay. And then I talked to Ignacio, and Ignacio said, I have a counterexample. And then I thought about it, and I said, I have a counterexample. Okay. So the three of us had counterexamples, and we wrote a paper. Okay. Now this is similar to that counterexample, and what you're going to do is you have a green model here that is the truth model. Here's your reduced model, okay? And I have this adjustable parameter that I can use to match to the truth model here. And what's going to happen is I'm going to start at the optimum right there, okay? That's the optimum for this problem. And I'm going to match my reduced model, and it moves away. I'll match it again, and it moves away. And eventually it converges to something that is not the optimum that I started with, okay? So that is my reduced model, my surrogate model that I would put into the optimizer, okay? So how do I make this work? Well, the way I would make this work is, first of all, make sure that the model here has a nice property, which is called kappa fully linear. That's why I have two coefficients instead of one. And then what I do is I start, again, it doesn't matter where, but let's say it's not at the optimum, and I have a trust region, okay? And now I decide on how well I'm solving that problem with the trust region. And eventually, I converge, okay? But at each point, I am readjusting A and B so that that has to happen, okay? So that's basically the idea. Now, what does that mean for much larger problems? So here's a problem we've been working on for several years. This is oxycombustion. What you'd like to do is you'd like to take an air-fired plant or some kind of fuel-fired plant. You'd like to, instead of firing it in air, you'd like to fire this in pure oxygen. And then what you'd like to do is capture the CO2 that comes out, because it's mostly CO2 and water, okay? So this has been a viable idea. Pilots have been built for this. And the crucial thing is, will the boiler, which is this CFD model, will that actually be good enough for you to optimize the whole plant, okay? So there's the model, okay? The boiler is in orange. That's your CFD beast, okay? The rest of it is all glass box, okay? And you can make the decision of either doing this with air or with an ASU over here, and then you have to remove remove the carbon dioxide, and then bring it up to 150 atmospheres for sequestration. So there's the problem, okay? How do we optimize this, given that you're never going to be able to put that boiler model as an equation-oriented model? It's not glass box. So we put together a 3D model over here It's a 3D PDE model. It's not quite the full CFD that has multi-phases and random walk models for the particles, but it's pretty good, and it's been validated pretty well. So that's the model. There's going to be our truth model, and we need to get surrogate models from that, okay? So there's the problem. We even did some surrogates on the steam thermodynamics, and we put it all together and added a few things, and what we had there was an optimization. It took a while, about 700, 800 calls to the CFD model, because our reduced model wasn't very good. That was the proof of concept. We wanted actually just to have a very simple reduced model. You go back and correct it. And then after 80 iterations, it actually converges, and you can prove that it converges. So we get an efficiency of about almost 40%. If you do carbon capture and then pay to do this in oxygen instead of combusting in air, you pay the price. You have to satisfy this much power over here, and so you lose a bit of your net power over here, and your efficiency goes down. So you pay this penalty, but it's actually quite good because the typical penalty is more like 10%. And then if you do some additional heat integration using something called Rankine recuperative cycles, you can actually take more advantage of that ASU, and you can recover a little bit more efficiency. And so now the penalty actually goes down to only 4.4%. Each of these optimizations was done with that fully 3D model embedded within a glass box model in the trust region framework. So that was basically what we had to do. Okay, so this is how we would actually be able to handle those tough models that might resist making them glass box. So the enabling tools, well, basically, we want to leverage the potential of glass box optimization, parallel decompositions, tailored reduced models. We have globally convergent algorithms to put them together, and we have tailored reduced modeling platforms. So hopefully this will give us some way of dealing with those multiple scales. Where is it going to be used? Well, I can see lots of places. First, heterogeneous models where you combine CFD and process flow sheets, maybe molecular dynamics. You integrate process design, control, and scheduling, and then you can integrate all types of time and length scales. And this is where I'm going to stop and say, this has been George's vision, this idea of multi-scale. Everything is integrated, and it's important not just to look at the plant over here, but to look at everything from the enterprise, the supply chain, all the way down to the atomistic structure. Now, what's interesting is that what links them together, what is the glue, is the reduced model, okay? If it's a good reduced model, you can apply fast optimization tools at the right levels, link them together, and now you have a strategy for basically doing an integrated optimization. That, I think, is the future, okay? So it enables fast, large-scale convergence strategies. We've had some success with a number of very diverse applications, from polymer processing to looking at magnetic recording materials to adsorption to power plants. So I think this is kind of the thing that we can start to expand. So I would like to say that's where we're going. So let me conclude and say, George, deepest appreciation and gratitude for all of the wealth of your contributions and your advice. Happy birthday. Best wishes for many more.
Thanks. Any questions? Up there. I think you'll have to come over to get a microphone. That'll work.
Yeah, super presentation. So I'm Zeta from MIT. Thank you, Prof, for the very interesting slide you showed to us. So basically, what attracted me most is actually the dynamic interaction just now, because we understand that for the process optimization, we have to concentrate on the static and dynamic. So we know that the static we have some kind of bigger the better, smaller the better, or nominal is the best. And yeah, and it's really attract me on how to tackling this problem, because the dynamic and static is really have a big difference in optimizing a process. So for example, in application of the carbon dioxide capture, so we have to optimize the reactor design itself, and also we have to optimize some of the biological reaction inside the photobioreactor itself for the power plant, because some of the power plant, we did grow some of the microalgae inside the photobioreactor itself. So this really concerns me most about the static and dynamic response in order for the optimizations.
Right.
Yeah.
Very good question, very interesting one, very interesting problem. I don't think I can answer your question completely, but I have some thoughts. The thoughts are the following. You've got a big toolkit that I've talked about, okay? That was the first part of the talk. And basically, the optimization tools that are available here, going back over here, these guys are actually pretty strong, okay? I mean, you can actually come up, if you know the toolkit well and you're used to using it, you can actually solve some extremely large problems, and you can do it, in a reasonable time. Now, it's not just the toolkit, okay? If you, for example, think about the problem of uncertainty with dynamics, there's the dynamic problem, and there's the previous problem that had the uncertainty in it. So what you're asking me to do is take this structure here, and inside each of these blue boxes, I'm going to put in a matrix like this. Okay? That's one way to look at it. But before you do that, and if you do that, there are these decomposition tools that will actually help you to solve that problem, even if the problem gets very, very large. But before you embark on that adventure, think very closely about your model. Okay? Think about, first of all, is that a model that is true? Has it been validated? Is it a model that actually is easy to solve in the sense of the nonlinearity, giving you some very nasty behavior? Think about that first. Second, think about what the uncertainty really means. Are you optimizing anything that is affected by the uncertainty, or are you not? Okay, think about where it goes in the problems, okay? Is it a matter of just backing off on your constraints, or do you have something more where you can adjust have a feedback to your uncertainty, okay? So the first thing to do is to formulate that problem extremely well. As an engineer, to know what it means in the real world, and then second, as an optimization practitioner, to see if you can use the tools that you know on it, okay? And then the third thing would be, after you've done all that, you'll either have a strategy with known tools, or you might feel adventurous and try to create some of your own. So maybe that's the best answer I could give.
Thank you very much. And by the way, I'm using a Minitab for the path of steepest ascent to optimize the response.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
So during the transition to our next speaker, George has many progenies that have crossed internationally in many, many companies and universities. And one of them includes the chair for the remainder of this session, Young Sub Lim, who's a professor of naval architecture and ocean engineering at Seoul National University. And he'll handle the rest of this session, including introducing the next speaker. Young Sub.
Thank you, Professor Brett. At first, it's my great honor to be here with the world-famous academics. I'm also George's academic grandson. I received my master and PhD degree from Seoul National University with Professor Jong-un Han, who completed his PhD with George in MIT in 1994. After graduation, I worked here at MIT as a postdoc in 2013, and in 2014, I returned to Seoul National University, but not in chemical engineering department. I joined to Department of the Naval Architecture and Ocean Engineering. I know it sounds weird. Korean shipbuilding companies were the world leading provider of very large vessels and offshore structures. But now they are in trouble due to the economic downturn and reduced oil price and also their own weakness in offshore engineering capability. So now I'm researching with the Korean shipbuilders to analyze, validate, and improve the design of the topside oil and gas process systems by using the knowledge of the process systems engineering. So if you have any interest in shipbuilding or offshore engineering, please let me know. The second speaker in this session is Professor Yaman Alkun, who is the second PhD student of George Stephanopoulos. As George has put it, with students like Yaman and Manfred, no problem was a hard problem. Yaman was prepared to take on challenges of ill-defined problems and make sense out on evolving field. Professor Yaman received his BS degree from Bogazici University in Turkey in 1974 and moved to the University of Minnesota, where he completed his master and PhD with George Stephanopoulos in 1976 and 1979, respectively. After graduation, he joined the Department of Chemical Engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and in 1985, he joined chemical engineering at Georgia Institute of Technology. In 1999, he was appointed Dean of Engineering at Koç University in Turkey, where he created a first-rate engineering school by hiring many bright academics and developing an aggressive research-oriented mentality based on high standard of excellence. In 2003, he was appointed provost at Koç University, and during his 6 years of tenure, he had a deep, lasting impact on the university direction and accomplishments. Professor Alkun received the Donald P. Ekman Award in 1985, presented by the American Automatic Control Council in recognition of outstanding contributions in the field of the automatic control. He is a member of Turkish Academy of Science and also has been recognized with the Turkish Scientific and Technological Council Science Award in 2003 and the Summer Professional Award in Chemical Engineering given by Middle East Technology University in 2003. Please welcome Professor Yaman.
Thank you. I'm very honored and proud to be part of this important symposium, which marks George's 70th birthday and retirement from MIT. I met George at the University of Minnesota about 40 years ago. I was finishing up my master's, and George was trying to recruit his first PhD students. Working with George was I must say, a turning point in my career and life, which I dearly cherish. George was very instrumental in reshaping the field of process control, and I think his background in process systems engineering, open-mindedness, fresh ideas helped the field tremendously. I picked a topic which I think has interested George throughout his career. He was always interested in the concept of, I think, complexity, if I'm not mistaken, and hierarchies going all the way back to his PhD thesis, where he looked at two-level optimizations. And when he came to University of Minnesota, he wanted to carry out these ideas, and I think he wanted to see their applications within process control field. Now, I understand that George is ready and wants to do different things in life, and I wish him a very happy, healthy, and prosperous season to enjoy. Now, I picked the topic of complexity and hierarchy, and it seems like it's very fitting to this symposium because we already heard a lot about complexity and to some extent hierarchies within the context of modeling. So in 1962, Herb Simon published an important paper called The Architecture of Complexity and shared his views on the topic. So I think since we have been hearing about these two issues, let's quickly go over some of the points that he brings out. Now, he says a complex system is made up of a large number of parts that interact in a non-simple way. They are less affected by external disturbances if they are hierarchically organized and decomposable systems. A hierarchy consists of a number of subsystems organized in a functional and spatial relationship to one another, and in their totality possess the correct character of an integral whole. And most importantly, the hierarchical whole has some new properties which fulfills previously non-existent functions. So you basically, by putting systems in together, you achieve more than the individual parts. Now, in 1980, we have already seen this paper in a couple of talks. In 1980, George published his first control paper, defining the synthesis of control structures for chemical processes. Now, this paper is important in many ways. First of all the authors are retiring one by one. So Manfred retired last year. Well, George, I think, messed up the sequence. And I'm about to retire, hopefully, next year. And on a more serious note, this paper, I think, is important because we see the emergence of, for the first time, temporal and spatial hierarchies in chemical engineering literature within the context of control. And these hierarchies later form the foundations of plant-wide control and real-time optimization. Now, in the rest of my talk, I will try to show how these concepts, basically complexity, temporal and spatial hierarchies, appear in biological systems. In particular, in recent years, I have been interested in signal transduction pathways within cellular networks. So these signaling pathways consist of signaling proteins that transmit an information that's contained in a stimulus outside the cell, all the way to the cell and to the nucleus, where most of the important cellular functions are executed. So it's basically an information flow diagram. And I'm going to pick a case study, a much studied system, MAPK pathway. This pathway is important. There are lots of results in the literature. It is important because it plays a central role in controlling cellular growth, proliferation, differentiation, apoptosis, and so forth. And for this reason, it has been a therapeutic target for also treatment of cancer. So the way the signaling path works, the signaling path is initiated by binding of an external stimulus, in this case, epidermal growth factor. It binds to its receptor, and this is followed by a series of reactions. These are phosphorylation reactions that different signaling proteins are involved. And through these reactions, ERK, which is an important protein, gets activated. It gets translocated to the nucleus, where it promotes the transcription of genes that we need for different cellular functions. So if you look at the system from a hierarchical point of view, we naturally see actually a spatial decomposition, like three subsystems. There is one that consists of the plasma membrane and extracellular space, where the binding occurs, the initial phase. Then the cytoplasm, where the signal propagates through the proteins. And then eventually the nucleus. And interestingly, those subsystems have some sort of a temporal decomposition because they operate in different time scales, where the events here are in the order of hours. As you go up, they are in the order of minutes. Now, it plays a central role in cell cycle control. So here, I am going to try to conceptualize the cell cycling control and ERK signaling as a hierarchical control problem. Now, at the top of the hierarchy, there is a supervisory controller. This is the master controller that tries to schedule the different events or the phases of the cell cycle, which consists of growth, DNA, synthesis, and mitosis. So it's basically an event scheduler operating at the high level. Now, each of these phases requires a different type of a cycling, which is a protein, with a different type of a time trajectory. So you may consider these as set points for the system. Now, so the supervisory controller, in order to start the cycle and control the progression of the cycle through different phases, requests or orders the lower layer controller, which is the MAPK pathway, to produce these cyclins. So at the lower level of the hierarchy, we have the MAPK control system with its regulatory feedback loops. Basically, the signaling pathway generates different activity of ERK in the cytoplasm and the nucleus to generate the desired cyclin. So it is exactly like a hierarchical control that operates for different process control systems. Now let us see how the regulatory feedback structures for signaling pathways are synthesized and how it applies to the MAPK pathway. Now the problem is quite similar to process control structure synthesis, and it goes through the same type of questions that were posed in that 1980 paper. So we have the cellular signaling pathway here, and then the controller, the feedback regulator here. The components of the feedback architecture consists of measurements, actually the sensor molecules that will provide the measurements to the controller. So those molecules have to be selected. And then we need the manipulated variables or the actuators, which will act on the signaling pathway. And then the controller actually consists of another signaling pathway or a reaction network, which consists of the map, basically, the relationship between the measurements and the actuators. So the synthesis problem is to select the sensor molecules, actuator species, and the reactor network that models the relationship between these two sets. Now let us see how actually nature has developed this control system for the MAPK pathway. Now the feedback control systems for signaling pathways consist of a set of positive and negative feedback loops. And that unique combination determines everything. So in the case of MAPK pathway, one set of controllers operate on the cell surface. Another set of controllers operate in the cytoplasm. And another set of controllers originate in the nucleus. And these are transcriptional controllers. So TACE, which is an enzyme, basically cleaves the membrane-bound growth factor and makes it available for signaling. So the growth factor binds to its receptor and activates ERK. This forms a positive feedback loop that sustains ERK signaling. The other ones are negative feedback loops. This one occurs internally in the cytoplasm. So when ERK is active, it actually disassociates this complex. So it forms a negative inhibitory feedback, and it inhibits itself. So it's a negative feedback loop. And the others are transcriptional loops. Basically, ERK produces its own regulator, in this case, the inhibitors. So Argos, and these are double specific phosphatases, these two proteins inhibit actually. They are produced by ERK, but in turn inhibit ERK in different ways. And these effects are actually interestingly hierarchically spatially distributed. So the phosphatase inhibits the ERK in the nucleus. Argos, which is produced in the nucleus, goes back and inhibits ERK activity outside by inhibiting the binding of EGF with the receptor. So here there is enough flexibility to sustain the signal, to deactivate it inside and also outside. So it's a pretty rich framework. And if you look at the whole system, where the closed loop system, here we have the plant, so-called open loop system, and here we have the control system. Now the controllers, these are basically actuators, proteins or genes that operate like actuators, are hierarchically organized, and they affect the different parts of the process. Some operate in the nucleus, some operate in the cytoplasm, some operate outside. Now let's look at the closed loop dynamics of this pathway with these controllers. Now, first of all, probably the most important trait or characteristic of signaling pathways is bistability. So most proteins and genes switch from one stable state to another to be able to perform their functions. So bistability is basically, if you look at the input-output map here, is an unstable branch separating two stable branches. So bistable systems actually operate like A to D converters. You receive a continuous signal from outside, from the stimulus, and bistability provides a switch, on and off switch, or active and inactive switch for a protein. And these exist in many signaling pathways, and they are robust because they hold for a wide range of parameter values, controller gains, and so forth. So most systems have this robust property and switching behavior. So this happens in many networks. If we look at the MAPK pathway, we see bistability for this system as well. And it's actually quite interesting. The characteristic of the bistable behavior and the associated dynamics depends on the type of feedback loops you have on and off or off. So this is a plot of ERK activity versus the external stimulus growth factor, epidermal growth factor. So the first curve, this one, the bistable curve, is when we have only the positive feedback loop, the autocrine loop. The other negative feedback loops are off. They are disconnected. They are not active. This other, so basically this is a stable branch, unstable, the blue is the unstable branch, and you have the red upper stable branch. ERK basically switches between inactive and active states, depending on the cellular function it has to perform. Now, if you look at the other curve, this one, which looks more interesting, that's when we have only negative feedback loops. Okay? So all the other loops and the behaviors by stable curves are actually within this feasible region bound by these two asymptotes. So if you look at this more carefully, this asymptote, when you introduce negative feedback, actually you introduce Hopf bifurcation oscillations. So you have the stable states, unstable states, then there is an intermittent branch of stable states here with Hopf bifurcations, and then unstable branch and stable branch again. So this brings up a very rich dynamics for the system. So you can have oscillations with small amplitudes, oscillations with large amplitudes, decaying dynamics, and so forth. This is very important because basically the information that is necessary to perform a certain cellular function is encoded in these dynamics. Okay, so sometimes you require oscillations, sometimes you require decaying oscillations depending on the ultimate task of this pathway. So by rearranging the loops actually and adjusting the gains of the controllers, you can perform different tasks. And of course, the cell is quite smart. These networks are quite smart because they are adaptive. So you can have reconfigurable feedback loops within the system. Sometimes negative loops are active, sometimes our positive loops are active. And these are actually experimentally verified as well. So if you look at the next slide, here we emphasize the importance of adaptive systems. So the loops are smart because they are adaptive. They can reconfigure their structures depending on the stimulus actually. So MAPK's topology, which is actually the reaction network, changes or adapts to different external stimulus to generate different dynamics and biological responses. So for quite some time, it has been well known actually that when the external stimulus is EGF, epidermal growth factor, the response is transient. So that's basically ERK activity, which is a transient response. And that leads to proliferation of the cell. But when the external stimulus, because the cell receives, the same cell receives different type of stimulus. So if the stimulus is nerve growth factor, a different type of stimulus, then the response of the same pathway is actually sustained, which leads to differentiation. So the question is, how does this happen? This happens, again, it has been verified experimentally. It happens because the loops reconfigure themselves. So this reaction network, when it receives a different stimulus, rearranges itself and provides a different response. So in this case, for the response to be transient, the negative loops should be on, and the positive loops should be off. Otherwise, the signal would be sustained. And in the other case, when the response is sustained, the positive loop is on, the negative loops are off. So basically, the cell recognizes the stimulus, the type of the stimulus. It rearranges itself, the loops, and provides the right response. So this is also mentioned in the literature as rewiring the loops for specificity, because the system provides different specific responses to different stimulus. Now, of course, in order to analyze and engineer these feedback loops, we need a framework. So in my opinion, the right framework is actually hybrid control, because the structure itself is changing. So there are decisions that are discrete, and there are decisions that are also continuous. So the change of the topology, switching the active loops on and off, that's a discrete decision. Changing the continuous stimulus, the dose of the growth factor, that's a continuous decision. Okay? So hybrid control is a natural way to at least analyze these systems and engineer them actually, if possible. So if we go back to the MAPK pathway and just consider two loops, there are many, but I'm considering two loops, one of them positive, the other one is negative. Actually, you need the positive loop to get bistability, okay? But they work in tandem, actually, the positive and negative. It's like a dual controller. So these are the controllers for, this is the positive loop, TACE, autocrine, and that's one of the negative feedback loops. And this is the continuous growth factor. So the hybrid controller would work as a coordinator and optimally actually adjust EGF and would decide which loop is on and which loop is off by 0-1 on-off decisions. Now, these controllers, of course, have to be modeled. And there are different ways to do this. In our work, we have used basically this type of model. So those of you who are familiar with the Hill kinetics, Hill functions, sigmoidal functions, which are used semi-empirically, semi-theoretically to model reaction and networks in biological systems, they are common. So these are basically Hill-type controllers, where the actuation is determined by Hill kinetics and sigmoidal functions, where you can adjust the steepness of the sigmoidal function. Okay? So that's how it would work. We have not done many extensive simulations or optimizations with this type of network. This is a recent idea, but I have done one simulation that I will show you, and where the coordinator basically acts on these controllers. So let's look at this result, and then I'm going to have the concluding slides with some future challenges. So imagine that this is the desired ERK profile, because this ERK profile would produce an optimal cyclin or protein that will be used by the cell cycle controller. So imagine that that's what you want. So ERK is inactive, and then it becomes active. It basically switches to the second state, stable state, and inactive again. So it goes between active and inactive states. It stays for some time as active and then comes back again. Okay, so how can we generate this? By using the two control loops and the experimental growth factor. So these are the decisions at the disposal of the controller. So initially, the system is at a quiescent state right here, because the growth factor stimulus is at its minimum. Okay? And ERK is quiescent. If you look at these loops, so this is TACE. So the positive loop is on. The negative loop, which is the inhibitory loop, is off. So you initialize this system and you start from the lower steady state. Now, in order to switch to the upper steady state, to activate ERK, you need the stimulus, because this is the primary stimulus. So you introduce a pulse in EGF, and it stays there for a while, and then you bring it down. So as soon as the pulse gets introduced, ERK moves to its upper steady state. It basically switches, and then it stays there even when EGF returns back. So it sustains itself because the positive loop is there, because you have the autocrine positive feedback. So even when this comes down, you see, autocrine feedback is still on, and then this is on as well. But after a while, you want the ERK to come back to its quiescent state, which implies the positive feedback has to switch off, and the negative feedback, which is inhibitory, has to switch on. So that's actually what's happening. So stimulus returns, the positive feedback comes down, because you don't want to sustain the signal anymore, and the negative feedback, also inhibitory feedback, brings it down. So you can basically orchestrate, actually, the actions of these control loops and the external stimulus to basically obtain any dynamics you want from ERK. And that's basically because of the rich characteristics that you can see in this analysis. So you can travel anywhere in this feasible region by adjusting the controller gains, and you can obtain the corresponding dynamics. So some challenges for the future. I guess the first question is how complex should the models become? I mean, we have heard this in different contexts, right? Modeling, optimization, and so forth. So these models, how complex should they be? Now, there is a lot in the literature using actually Boolean models, 0 ones, versus mechanistic mass action kinetic type of models. And then one can actually possibly combine these. Some parts of the pathway which switch can be just Boolean because you don't need much detail. It's just on and off. But the other part which doesn't switch may require more detailed mass kinetic models. A new paradigm, will it emerge? What kind of a paradigm that will be? That's a question I cannot predict, but I'm sure there will be some combinations which require the least amount of information and complexity without compromising the essential features of the pathway's functioning. The other aspect is the reduction of the complexity of the biochemical networks, because these networks are complex. If you try to model every signal in protein or gene, it becomes huge. Is that necessary? And again, can you, like we have done with neural networks, can you prune the network? Can you lump certain species? Can you compartmentalize it? And can you simplify it without losing the essential features, the dominant features, because you don't want to lose properties like bistability and so forth when you reduce complexity. Okay? So one has to decide on which characteristics to retain and how to systematically reduce the network. Now, obviously, there is work actually in both areas, but they are not in any way complete. Now, the third area is in the area of synthetic biology. Once we understand how these loops operate, can we engineer them? And once we engineer them, can we implement it in vivo or in silico? Now, there is work, especially for genetic circuits. There is less on signal transduction pathways, but I think in the future we will see these applications either in silico or in vivo, synthetic controllers, so that we can do things that the nature doesn't do actually, if that's going to help us. Now, the last item is spatiotemporal control of multiple signaling pathways. Now, I picked one pathway, but in a cell, there are many pathways doing different jobs and interacting with each other. And that is when things really get large scale and hierarchical. So I'm giving this slide just as a motivating, concluding slide. We worked on this problem. Now, for example, here you have the MAPK pathway, and there's another pathway, AKT insulin pathway, to control glucose. Now, these pathways, for example, talk to each other. They interact with each other. So these are like our chemical plants, subsystems, and the interactions in the biology literature, this is called the crosstalk. So they interact through complex mechanisms, through different types of feedback loops. And in fact, this is a network, so you can conceptualize the crosstalk interactions as another reaction network with feedback loops. And they cooperate, actually. I mean, this network has to work in such a way that both signaling pathways do their jobs. This is for glucose transport, and that's for cell cycle, without interfering with each other. And they do, actually. So this pathway inhibits this one, this pathway inhibits the other one, but the feedback loops are arranged in such a way that inhibition actually, cross inhibition is cooperative. Okay? So that I see as the most complex problem. Many signaling pathways operating at the same time and are responding actually to different stimulus. This responds to insulin, this responds to EGF, and they talk to each other. So let me conclude with this slide. Again, I want to thank George for everything he has done to the field process control, to my education, and I want you to have a nice, happy retirement from MIT, and happy birthday.
Okay, we can have one short question. So any question? It seems too complex to ask something. So I have a short question. My students do not want to see complexity. They just want to solve simple problem. So could you kindly advise to young students who don't want to have complexity in their lives?
Yeah, this is, I think, a very important point. A point that we struggle with all the graduate students. Well, I tell my students that it's not worth solving simple problems. So you have to somehow convince them that they have to work on challenging problems to make meaningful contributions. So it's just a matter of convincing them and giving them examples from the field so that they work on worthwhile problems, and there's no success without sweat.
Thank you, Professor Arkun.
Thank you.
Matthew did deliver a truly pioneering learning algorithm which bridged the two areas of scientific numerical computing and machine learning. After graduation from MIT, he joined Professor Yaman Arkun's group at Georgia Tech, and now he is Professor and David Wong Senior Fellow at School of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering at Georgia Tech. His research interests are in the areas of process design, simulation, scheduling, and control. He currently focuses on the design of operation of processes that minimize waste production by recovery of usable products from waste streams. In particular, he is interested in carbon capture process, both from flue gas and dilute capture from air, as well as the design of processes that use biomass. Please give Professor Yarp a big applause.
So thank you for that kind introduction. According to my watch, we should have been on break 5 minutes ago. Unfortunately, one of the problems I've not worked on is signal compression, so we'll have to see how well I can do here. So what I wanted to talk to you today about was Bayesian process engineering, which, if you like, is what I will say is my vision for what process systems engineering needs to become over the next 20 to 30 years. So basically, what I think that we need to be thinking about carefully is this idea that we have a whole variety of information that sits at multiple different places in multiple different scales, being generated in multiple different ways. And all of that information somehow has to be integrated together to be able to have effective chemical engineering systems. So basically, I'm envisioning process systems engineering as an integrative discipline along this data supply chain, where we could be generating petabytes of data at the operating plant level, but at the same time, it may be that our experimental colleagues are generating information at an extremely slow rate, for example, by taking multi-component isotherms at cryogenic conditions. If you've ever spoken to your experimental colleagues about taking multi-component isotherms at cryogenic conditions, you'll know that this is not exactly the stuff that proceeds at a very high rate. Similarly, we may be performing molecular simulations which in themselves may take several days to run before they finish, or we could be doing complex CFD calculations. The question is how to integrate that information together to come up with a more effective chemical processing industry. And so what I want to do is I want to really discuss three problems. How to fuse data from different sources with different fidelity across time. So we're generating experimental results. How do we update models to include that new information? How do we value the information and guide new information acquisition, essentially experimental design? And how to support decision-making in uncertain and evolving environments? Those are the three questions I'd like to take on. So I'm going to take as my central goal the idea of inference, or essentially taking observational data, model and model parameters, and our background and a priori knowledge to make inferences. So for example, today is the 1st of June. Today is my wedding anniversary. Therefore, it is George's birthday. Now, my wife always agrees with me that that is the order in which the inference ought to go. And in fact, she's correct. So in deterministic inference, what we're doing is we're seeking single values of the model parameters to explain the data. And we use regularization to enforce smoothness conditions and around the solution and handle outliers, i.e. closeness to an a priori model. So we may define a misfit function where essentially we minimize some distant measure, whatever that distance measure may be, not only between the observations and what our model is saying, but also between what our model is and what our a priori beliefs are around what that model needs to be. Now in probabilistic inference, what we're doing is we're inferring the probability distribution of a random variable rather than inferring a single value. And what we're looking for is the posterior, i.e. the distribution of the variable after we have experienced data. So we're given the data and background information, and it quantifies the chance that a given model is a true one. So it moves away from the idea that there is a single model and towards the idea that we actually have a distribution over our models. So in this case, calculus is the language for reasoning about rates of change, but probability is the language for reasoning around uncertainty. So given the limited assumptions around rational beliefs, Bayesian updating, after the Reverend Thomas Bayes, an English nonconformist minister who died actually in 1759, no one actually knows what year he was born, but they do know his age. Therefore, we can infer a probability distribution over his birth. That what we have is we have to use this Bayes formula to essentially come up with our posterior parametric distribution of our parameters given the measurements, given that we can say something about how likely those measurements are given our model parameters, and that we have some priori or a parametric prior distribution that we're going to use. And the hard part in this inference is actually performing this integration over all the model space, the parameter space, to be able to normalize this expression. So this now means that in Bayesian terms, the complicated calculation is really performing this integration. So exact evaluation of this posterior expectation is probably intractable, but there are plenty now of approximate inference to do this, either by approximate deterministic approaches or approximate stochastic approaches. And I will just talk about stochastic approaches today. Now, another way of looking at this is actually to think of this as a machine learning problem, again, where we're making inferences about missing or latent data from the observed data. So, for example, a well-defined model makes predictions about unobserved data. And this reminds me of an anecdote that I was once told about Linnaeus Pauling, who said that, all models, to be a good model, must make predictions. If your model makes no predictions at all, I can't even call it a bad model. Here, what we have is we're going to use now our posterior of the parameters, given our data and model, as the prior to be able to make a prediction about the next set of test data. So in this case, we're using it here to make a prediction, but we can also use it, in essence, to compare models to figure out which model is actually the best one in terms of fitting our data given the model, for which we integrate over the model parameters here where M stands for a particular class of models. So this enables us to both make predictions and also to compare models. So what we have is a complete paradigm for making inferences over models to be able to make predictions and decide between models and to calibrate models against experimental data. So here's an example of doing Bayesian engineering, and I'm going to do this in the case of an adsorption modeling process. I'm going to show data fusion for isotherm data to indicate how we can take experimental data and computationally generated data and try to integrate those together to give us a more complete picture of the isotherm parameters. Uncertainty quantification for cyclic process performance to determine the reliability of model predictions. And then lastly, to try to optimally design a new isotherm experiment to attempt to reduce the uncertainty in the amount of CO2 we can absorb using our adsorption process. So in this case, I'm going to take adsorption isotherm data from a particular MOF absorbent, which is a large cage adsorbent. And this is information collected on CO2 from the NIST database. And this is from 9 different experimental groups. So here's the point. What we have is we have experimental data that is, so essentially our uncertainty around this data is itself unknown. It's coming from different experimental groups with different equipment who may have different procedures. And it's clear that we can't just take their single values. We're going to have to try to understand how uncertain that data is and try to integrate it together. So we're going to use a Langmuir isotherm for simplicity, where indeed these are the 4 unknown parameters that we're going to try to infer from the data that we have from NIST. So we're going to start with a relatively uninformed prior, and then our uninformed prior will essentially be refined to fit to the experimental data. And so what you see here is you see the 95% credible intervals, that is 95% of the probability distribution falls within that, and you see the experimental data itself. So what happens over the iteration of the algorithm is you see that eventually the algorithm is able to sit upon credible intervals and also a prediction interval, here 5%, and it's also deciding at the same time exactly how to decide what the uncertainty that should be assigned to these different experimental points are. Now you can see that we've got experimental data all over the map. We've got it at very low pressures, we have some at moderate pressures. Here at this temperature, we have complete isotherms that go up to very high pressures, and the algorithm is essentially able to integrate this information together to give us a much better idea than we would have if we had one experimental isotherm from a single experimental group. So being able to fuse data together this way is an extremely useful activity. Now the next thing that we have is that we actually can use this data and then add to it the data from computational modeling. So here we have data from molecular simulations, and what we can see is we actually have to widen our curves significantly to be able to accommodate that information. And the reason is because that molecular simulation data is unfortunately itself very uncertain. We're estimating, in fact, these error bars at the same time as we're fitting this data. But in fact, if we can use this and then we can gain sort of confidence in where we think this data may be useful, we can go back and maybe help the molecular simulations people refine their simulations to fit better with the experimental data that they're measuring. Similarly, if we are able in the future, 10, 15, 20 years from now, where we have much better molecular simulation algorithms, that data may provide valuable insight into places where we cannot take the experiments themselves. So this is a way, again, of integrating multiple sources of data together to be able to give you a better picture of what is essentially going to be the information you need to proceed to design. So in the next step, what I'm just going to look at is actually now doing parametric inference. So I'm going to look at essentially estimating the posterior distribution of the parameters of a larger scale model, and then using that as a way to then propagate that through to getting the probability distribution over my predicted variables given my measurements, where my hidden variables have essentially been integrated out of the model. So my hidden variables here are in fact my model, right? I've integrated out my model to be able to find how my predictions depend on what I have measured up to now, knowing that I used a model in the middle as a way of doing this. Now, the types of models we're using here are obviously equation-oriented models rather than the types of models that we were talked about this morning by Yannis. Yannis described his models as medieval in sense that they took data and they essentially fit the data. I actually think of them more as cubist. They're cubist in the sense of Georges Braque rather than medieval in the sense of Brunelleschi, because they are actually twisting the data and turning it around rather than actually sort of a faithful portrait of the Christ child with Mary, which is what most medieval pictures were. So what you've got is you've got this ability to propagate this information through these systems, and I'm going to do it in the context of an adsorption process, where this adsorption process essentially takes flue gas and passes it over a bundle of fibers, where that bundle of fibers is going to essentially adsorb the CO2. Then we're going to desorb the CO2 by using hot water flowing through the bores of these fibers. And this refers back to Shinji's talk this morning, where essentially what we have here is a microchemical system, but in a large scale, where each one of these fibers is acting as a microchemical system with an adsorbent suspended in the polymer annulus of the fiber. And then what we're going to do is we're going to cool and sweep the CO2 back out of the module. So we want to be able to predict this performance, and we want to be able to do it using the isotherm data that we used earlier for the adsorption process, and knowing that we have significant uncertainty around the mass transfer parameters within this fiber bundle. We have uncertainty around, for example, where the fibers would be positioned within the cross-section of the module, etc. So there's quite a lot of uncertainties that we have in this model, and what we're trying to do is predict the breakthrough curve on the adsorption to know how much CO2 we can pull out of the flue gas before we have to stop and regenerate it. So in this case, there are totally 10 unknown model parameters. We're going to comprise of 8 coupled PDEs. It's not that large. It takes about 5 minutes to simulate the adsorption step and about 45 to 50 minutes to reach cyclic steady state. Now here again, what I'm going to say is we're not necessarily using the most advanced techniques in this area. If we were, we could reduce the time it takes to be able to simulate this process, and by so doing, increase the speed at which we're able to make these inferences. So relying on advances in modeling is extremely important to be able to carry out these kinds of computations in the future. So this doesn't ignore what we've done in the past. It really builds on what we've done in the past to be able to perform inferences much faster if we have better modeling at the level of the process itself. What we have is we have experimental data on the breakthrough curves, and these breakthrough curves are measured for 10 and 17-inch long modules at particular temperatures. So we have 2 different module lengths, and we have 3 or 4 different temperatures at which we're going to be able to get this breakthrough curve. And then we have some uncertainty around the actual experimental points themselves. And what we want to be able to do is integrate this information to be able to understand what the value probability distributions is over these 10 unknown model parameters. That's the goal that we have, is to take this data and use it to do this. And again, these are experiments that are not easy to perform. These are modules that are not easy to build. And so you're trying to squeeze as much information out as you can out of these experiments in order that you can scale these modules up when you go to the next level. So this is essentially just describing how that's done. We have a measurement with some sort of noise model. We have a number of experiments, and essentially we propagate that information through the model. For every sample value of our parameters, we do full forward simulation for each experiment to calculate the likelihood. Now, each one of these full forward simulations can be done essentially in parallel in some way, because we can effectively take our distribution, split it up, run particles that represent that probability distribution, run them forward, reinitialize, and then run forward, and creep up on the posterior distribution of the parameters given the data. So that's what I'm going to show. So I'm using sequential Monte Carlo simulation, and essentially what happens here is that the particles are initiated across the probability distribution. Those particles evolve with time over short hops using Markov chain Monte Carlo simulation, and the probability distribution as a whole is then evolving as you do this simulation. And what this enables us to do is it enables us to parallelize the computation so that we can essentially do each one of these change in parallel and end up with the final probability distribution, where we're creeping up on that probability distribution by varying the influence of the posterior from essentially having a 0 coefficient on this posterior to having a coefficient of 1. So essentially it's a relaxation that then enables us to creep up on the posterior distribution simulation. Now, I think what was mentioned earlier is this idea of using a much richer representation of the results of the simulation than we had before. So in this case, what we're able to do is we're able to look at those 10 parameters, and we're able to look at how the final probability distributions are correlated, for example, with one another. Here's a correlation between psi, which represents the fraction of surface sites for adsorption in the polymer, versus B, which is one of the isotherm parameters. And what we're able to see is that the gray is actually the priori information that we had on the isotherm, and that a priori information that we had on the isotherm has been refined by the experiments that we have done with the modules. So we've reduced the uncertainty there, and at the same time we've introduced new parameters that have to do solely with the performance of the modules themselves. So in this case, this would be the mass transfer resistance parameters. So this again shows how we can integrate information from the isotherm with information from the module performance to be able to arrive at a system that is actually much more effective in using the information presented to it. Now, what does that eventually lead to? Well, what you do is then you can use that to make a prediction about the module performance, and here are the traces of the cyclic performance of a module that has actually been then subsequently designed using those parameters, where you see, in fact, that we're now able to trace, and at this point would be where we, for example, might cut off our value, and here is where we might start collecting the CO2, and we can now understand what our uncertainty is overall in the performance of our system. And so this is what we see. We see that we can get CO2 purity and CO2 recovery, and you can see that we have quite a distribution here in the values of our purity and our recovery, and that this is basically without prediction, this is without the error that would be in the actual measured values themselves. In other words, without that extra uncertainty term, just propagating the uncertainty through the model itself. And so you can see that we have a reasonable degree of confidence in our purity, but our recovery is going from 30 to 55%. And the reason for that is because this boundary here is shifting backwards and forwards. Small changes in this would actually mean that we would end up with recovering more or less CO2. Now, what we have not done here, and it clearly is the next step, will be to go back and now do the redesign of this cycle in order to be able to make these results more robust. And so that would be the next step, would now be going back from here and ring a redesign. But now at least we understand exactly the sensitivity and the probability distribution of our results to the parameters that we have uncovered. So I'm going to quickly step through this. This is the last part that I wanted to say, which is that we can actually define utility function, i.e. the value of the information of taking a new experimental point at D. And so what we can do is we can find the relative improvement in the distribution of our performance parameters after we have taken an experiment that we've performed at D. And so if we can do this kind of calculation, what we can do then is we can say, where is the next point that we ought to sample in order to be able to improve the performance? Not here in terms of the parameters, say, of the isotherm distribution, but how do those parameters, improving those, enable us to improve the performance of, say, the breakthrough curve, right? So that's the point. We want really to go all the way through to the end of the model, not actually stopping at the point of understanding how the uncertainty is reduced in the isotherm parameters. And so we can do this actually by using instead of actually doing the model itself, we can find the parameters to which the performance is sensitive. We can use global sensitivity analysis to do that. And then what we can do is use that utility function to be able to define where to take the next data point. So in this case, this is looking at a situation where we have this utility function. We have a low utility experiment here. We have a high utility experiment here in this particular case. This is defined here in the space of the parameters where we could, of the experiment where we would actually do the isotherm. So we would be doing an isotherm value at a particular pressure and a particular temperature. And that's the utility function value, which is pretty flat, but then at this end of the spectrum kind of dives off a cliff. And the reason for it diving off a cliff, by the way, is because the uncertainty in taking the experiment at these particular values is very high. So there's not very much information value in taking the experiments here. The information is much more valuable here because the uncertainty around the values themselves is lower. That's the reason that you see this particular shape. So here, we could take the experiment at this set of conditions for the pressure, or we could take it at this set of conditions, and this would be the equilibrium absorption capacity that you would be measuring in the experiment. So we could add either the experimental point could be added here, or the experimental point could be added there. If we add those in different places, you can see that we're actually able to tighten the distribution of our absorption capacity and thereby actually improve the performance of the device because we don't have this lower spread of the absorption capacity relative to this particular point where we took the experiment at the high utility value versus the low utility value. So, and again, we can see that we've got a shift in the credible intervals upwards for the high utility versus the low utility. All right, so that's 3 ways in which Bayesian reasoning can help us improve the performance of our process modeling and our experimental design and infusing data. Now, I wanted just quickly to end by talking about where I think this is going with respect to performance. So what we have seen, and what has been mentioned before, Jeff Linderoth made this point at FOCAP-D also, is that we've seen an enormous improvement in MILP algorithms, about 2.5 billion time improvement, partly due to machine performance, but also because of algorithm performance. So we're going to see continued improvements in our traditional process systems algorithms that are going to make the types of computations I talked about with Bayesian reasoning more feasible because it will cut down the time it takes to solve each individual model instance, okay? That's what I think I'm trying to tell you here. But what we're starting to see is that single core performance is not going to likely to improve much further and that we're going to shift towards an increasing number of cores. Exactly the point that Larry made earlier on, is that understanding how we can exploit these new computational architectures is really going to be the thing that drives us forward over the next 20 to 30 years. But in addition to being able to solve optimization and mixed integer linear programming problems, the other area we're seeing huge advances in is actually in logical reasoning and inference. So in other words, reasoning and inference algorithms are themselves also improving substantially relative to where they were 10 or 20 years ago. And really, if you think back to the days of the 1980s when AI is in its very infancy in that sense, those algorithms are now reaching the kinds of maturity that the optimization algorithms reached maybe a decade ago. So in other words, the AI field in some sense is somewhat behind the optimization field, but it's really starting to improve its performance, particularly, for example, with regards to things like satisfiability problems in propositional logic, where we can see that the performance in 2011 relative to the performance in 2002 has shifted dramatically in terms of the way that problems can be solved. So what we're seeing that in 2011, the biggest application, 10 million variables, 32 million clauses, and 76 million literals. This area is going fast and is going to improve fast for many of the reasons also mentioned earlier on today, that there is enormous focused effort in improving these kinds of algorithms by companies like Google, like companies like Facebook and social media and things that I don't understand. There's lots of that going on today, okay? And that is going to improve these algorithms substantially. If we look at MCMC, again, in the last 40 years, there's probably about a 500 and improvement, about 20 if you can do parallelization of the model evaluations. Combining that with machine performance, again, you get about a 1.7 billion time improvement. So again, we're going to see this improve. Was mentioned Amdahl's law earlier on. Amdahl's law in this area will help us enormously with regards to being able to parallelize these computations. So basically what we're going to see is we're going to see these embarrassingly parallel computations in chemical engineering driving our ability to get more information out of more models. So I'll return to my diagram, which is that I think we need to think about how we integrate these multiple types of information along a data supply chain and how this will happen between now and 2040. And I believe that this will be done by using large data sets and carefully designed small data sets, that we mustn't lose sight of the fact that there is enormous value to small data sets, and that we will have a lot of chemical engineering models driven by fundamentals, as well as those that can be derived just by looking at the data. And that we're going to do this through massively parallel probabilistic inference. But I cannot end without saying that one of the things that comes into the inferences that we do is the premises we make. And in the last 20 minutes, Someone just changed a lot of those premises. Thank you.
Okay, we have a time for question. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, for your talk, and I appreciated your inclusion of aspects of experimental design and its importance. I'm curious, you showed it in the context of uncertainty reduction. I'm curious if the Bayesian approach provides any specific insights regarding when problems are inherently identifiable or not. I know that in system identification, for example, there's persistence of excitation, conditions for how signals should be correlated or cross-correlated in order to have, just because you're fitting to data doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting a good model. And I'm just curious if there are any Bayesian insights into that.
I think in terms of parameters, the fact that you can see from the diagram, my scatter plot, when you can see when parameters become correlated or are correlated, right? So there is some insight in terms of whether or not there is this identifiability. For example, in isotherm models, I think it's pretty clear that we do not have clear identifiability if we're at the level, for example, of a Langmuir isotherm. It can be very difficult to get good identification between the K and the B in the isotherm parameter because they are highly correlated. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the model prediction itself can't be quite good, because in fact, if you choose those parameters from the correct probability distributions, you'll continue to generate good results. So the answer is it somewhat solves itself with regards to being able to get that kind of information and then use that appropriately to sample from your distributions of parameters. So it's got some of that built in, but I don't think it explicitly addresses the point that you just made directly.
Okay, next, please.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. My question is, for your model parameters, are you assuming conjugate prior distribution relative to your data, or there's no such assumption?
There's no such assumption.
Okay,
No.
thank you.
It's open. They're actually uniform price.
Over there, one more time. Please use the microphone over there.
Uh-oh. Is it time for a difficult question from Sandra?
No. It's always an easy question for you, Matt. All this assumes that you really want to fit parameters, and then the quality of the parameters is measured by essentially the statistical fitting. But very interesting question also, do we have the right model, the right parameters, the right number of parameters, too many, too few? And in fact, it may be possible just to augment your function, just to ask for low correlation between the parameters and just directly as a part of formulation, as a constraints or part of the objective function. Have you actually looked into things like that? Usually makes life a lot easier.
So I've not actually looked at that, but I think that is a very, very valuable point. And in fact, this whole idea, which I didn't touch on at all, right, which is model selection. I just talked about fitting parameters of a given model, but there is the whole question of what is the model form itself. But actually, that question can be formulated within the Bayesian framework relatively with some fiddling about, but basically it can be done so that you can actually identify not just the parameters of the model, but also which of the model and which model class best approaches fitting the data. Now, what I will say is one of the problems we've had is sometimes we can suck all the uncertainty out of certain parameters and place them into other parameters just because we now added a new set of uncertain parameters to our model. So for example, that I showed you there that we still had quite a bit of uncertainty and spread in many of our isotherm parameters. What we found is that the module, have I got time for this? What we found, I have. I declared it. What we found is that the module variability was actually mostly coming not from necessarily just the individual fiber performance, but actually the way that the experimentalist shoved the fibers into the module. and therefore what was the free surface area around each module that was available for flow. When we added those parameters, i.e. the uncertain placement of the fibers within the module to the model, a lot of the uncertainty that we saw in those parameters got sucked out of that and went actually into those fiber placement parameters instead. So you still can't make up for making bad modeling choices, right? And I guess I'm firmly convinced that that is why we will, well, most of us and a lot of us in the room have got a reasonable job security even in the age of Trump.
Thank you, Professor Liar. We can have a break time of 18 minutes, so let's start next session at 4:25. Thank you.